Welcome to the B-Sides and Beers podcast.
All right, welcome to B-Sides and Beers podcast, episode 6. Wow, we're at 6 already. That's aces. We're just cruising through this. Tonight, we are talking about, what do we got here? Singles. Soundtrack to the movie Singles, 1992, written and directed by Cameron Crowe. Yeah, so here we go. What are we drinking tonight, boys?
As always, I'm drinking my Grunge pills.
Can't go wrong with the Roche. Flip?
I'm still drinking Miller Genuine Draft and Pink Whitney. Like I said,
You can't go wrong with those.
Yeah, it's my COVID stash.
That's the thing. You buy all pre and then you hide out in your bunker for 9 months.
Still doing it.
What you got there, Mike?
Good. Well, tonight we got some Okanagan Springs Ghost Trail Dark Lager.
Looks dark.
Yup. Brewed and bottled and all those things in Vernon, BC.
Delicious.
That is awesome. Too bad it's just a seasonal from what I understand. Otherwise, I'd buy it all the damn time. That's good. Cool. So let's get into singles.
Okay.
Dane, what made you choose this album?
I think because, honestly, Alice in Chains. And I got a whole story about that. But, yeah.
Please tell.
Like you said, this was a movie directed by Cameron Crowe. So if anyone's ever watched the movie Almost Famous, it's about the little kid that follows the band Clearwater.
Stillwater.
Come on.
I don't know what the actual band was that he followed. I think it was like a multitude of bands. And he wrote for Rolling Stone anyway. So he directed, and this was his second movie, I think. I think the one before this was actually people enjoyed. And
Yes, it was his second.
this movie sucked.
It wasn't an awful movie.
It sucked.
I disagree.
Well, I remember I went to actually watch it at the ripe old age of 12, and it had nothing to do with the soundtrack. It had nothing to do with all of the bands on the soundtrack that I loved. I remember being so excited, and like even the previews, there was like,
okay, I call bullshit because they were all in the movie.
oh yeah. They were all in the movie. That was the only good part about the movie. But the movie was about a relationship, I think. And even Matt Damon himself says the movie should have been done in New York, or in his heart, he wished the movie had been about New York or Manhattan or something about that.
Well, the movie was basically a love letter to Seattle. I mean, when Cameron Crowe moved to Seattle, all these bands he was very welcomed into this scene, and that was a big thing that he wanted to do, to kind of give back to these artists that sort of brought him in. Right?
Yeah.
So showed him some love.
I mean, and I think that's like how I remembered it. And then, I read a bunch of articles and I think one of the biggest, question marks on this soundtrack was like, how come Nirvana wasn't involved? And like, I think they were just too big. Because
Nirvana wasn't directly Seattle though. Right?
Well, I've got some background information on this. Nirvana was supposed to be on the soundtrack, but they blew up.
Yeah.
And Cameron Crowe couldn't afford the rights to put Smells Like Teen Spirit
I guess so,
on the album.
It was basically on the cusp of when they blew up, like milliseconds before they
it was literally months
on, right?
before, right? So like
Yeah.
92, Nevermind. January 11th.
That's
92,
that's
Nevermind
why it came out, because they were
like toppled Jackson's Dangerous off the charts. And then in June 30th, Singles came out. And for those who are listening, who are interested in actual like a documentary about grunge, check out Hype by Doug. Oh no, what's his last name here? We'll see. We can edit that in, maybe.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think
I know the one you're talking about.
one of the biggest things for me. I remember going to watch this movie and walking out like, that was not at all what I thought it was going to be. Although it did have like cameos, you know, of I think Eddie Vedder was in it, and he said some like he had a couple of like lines, and people were really impressed with that. Remember Alice in Chains being in it for a moment. I think members of Pearl Jam were
Chris Cornell was in it.
There was a bunch of people like making cameos in it, and I think that's what made this movie like really interesting to me. But
the cool thing was you look at the band in the movie Citizen Dick, and it was Eddie, it was Stone, and it was Ahmet that were everyone else in the band.
Yeah, and I think that's
because Eddie was the drummer.
Yeah,
right,
for sure. So, but that's what tied everything together. And I never really, I mean, it's obviously there when you look at it, but as far as the soundtrack goes, I think this was an ode to Mother Love Bone, and specifically Andy Wood, right? Because there's so many relations. I mean, as far as like you have Pearl Jam, and you have Soundgarden, and you have Temple of the Dog, and you have who else is on this? There's
Temple of the Dog was not on this, but
I'm just saying that like the
Mudhoney,
If you take a look at like the degrees of separation,
well, they're all in the same scene. I mean, that's why it was a scene, because all of them sort of fed off of each other. Quite often, they were all roommates of the others, kind of a deal, right? I mean, you look at I was reading there was the breakdown of what was it? Stone and Ahmet were working at a coffee shop together. Like this was back before any of them had any sort of chance of blowing up.
Yeah, and going back to Cameron Crowe too, like every time I hear this guy's story, like I'm just like, this sounded like it was the best time ever for this guy in the 90s. Like that must have been surrounded in that whole grunge scene and the whole Seattle scene. I mean, this album is Seattle for me. Like
he was in that perfect storm before everything blew up.
Like this is where I learned about this kind of stuff, right? Like I had known about Pearl Jam and stuff like that, and I had heard those songs off of 10, but I didn't really know the whole scene of Seattle until I really got a hold of this. And again, going with that first Alice in Chains Wood is the first track on this album, isn't it?
Yep. Yes, it was.
Yeah. And that was the first time I ever heard that. And I was just like, I remember my sister had it. I was like, what is this?
Yep.
Like, who is this? Like, and just to be the first song on the album, and again, probably to be for Andy Wood, it makes it.
Yep. Well, and you look at the track "Breath" for Pearl Jam's "Breath." It was an old song that Stone wrote in the Mother Love Bone days that never came out, and they ended up finishing it with Pearl Jam kind of deal. So
yeah, like I love that Chris Cornell. I love the Seasons track on it's so maybe good. My favorite Chris Cornell track, solo stuff, but. And I remember too the birth ritual. Like I remember Soundgarden, whoever's playing that in the show, in the movie, aren't they? I think that's the song. That I think they're playing.
Yep. Well, it's kind of cool too because they've got the main tracks, and then a couple of years back they came out with a deluxe version. It had songs from the that were on the movie that did not make it on the soundtrack, and you've got Jane's Addiction, you've got Muddy Waters, you got the Pixies, you got REM, you got Sly and the Family Stone, Tad. Who else was on?
And
there?
these were on these didn't make the cut?
A different, yeah. No, they were on the movie. They just didn't make it to the soundtrack. Yeah, so they're background songs for the movie that didn't make it to the soundtrack. So you got Alice in Chains, you got Public Enemy, you got The Cult. So these were songs that were on the movie but didn't make it to the soundtrack for whatever reason. So
because a lot of those guys aren't even from Seattle.
Right.
That's probably part of it. Like,
yeah,
kind of captures that whole Seattle thing. But they again we were talking about Purple Rain and the month difference between releasing that and then releasing the movie.
Right.
Because Nirvana blew up, they released this album 3 months before the movie even came out. Because they wanted to cap.
I heard the movie was in the can for a year before
they had finished it in '84, and that was an idea in '84, and then they wrapped it in '91, and then it just sat there. And then all of a sudden, everything exploded, and they were like, "Let's get this out right now, capture this whole moment." And then 3 months goes by, and then finally the movie comes out and kind of flops.
And I don't know if I read it right. I read it somewhere and I couldn't find it again. I like to find proper facts if I can.
Not me, man. I like making everything up. I like going off the cuff.
Mostly informed. Anyway, there was a part that I read that Eddie, when they filmed his part in the movie, he had only been in Pearl Jam for a couple months. Like this was, they were still recording 10 kind of thing. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. Hanging out with Cypress Hill. Good a mashup between.
Yep, so good.
That Citizen Dick album too. I read too that somebody's carrying that album around. Maybe it's, I can't remember. Again, I should probably watch this movie again. Maybe I shouldn't because I do remember it not being the best. But there's songs on that album that, like, Spoon Man is one of the tracks listed on that on the Citizen Dick album. You guys saw that too?
So
Seasons is on there
so
too.
Chris Cornell, from what I understand, he wrote a whole bunch of songs for that album. And only X amount whatever showed up on it, but on that track listing on the back, it was on there. So, like that's where the birth of Spoon Man idea came from, was that writing session that he did. So,
I read too that at that time, Seattle bands, they had 20%
really
top 10, and like
that's awesome.
20% from one city. Yeah, just wild. But tell us about that, your Alice in Chains connection, Dane, on the at the beginning.
We're
talking about that.
I never knew. I mean, when I think back to grunge, and it's interesting because you look at this this soundtrack, and I think this was sort of the definitive kind of commercial grunge, I guess, album that everyone just sort of said, yeah, okay, these are all the bands and these are who they are. And Alice in Chains was definitely one of them. And when you think of like the top four, there was like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden. Stone Temple Pilots were like there. I think now, man, Core was. When did Core come out? I remember listening to Core before.
Yeah, like 92, 93. But I mean, they're from California too.
Right. So it definitely wasn't a Seattle sound. And when you look into this, you have the Pumpkins from Chicago. Yeah. And even like I remember when you, like the preview for this on TV had Paul Wasterberg from not the Descendants. Who's he from?
Mm-hmm. Replacements.
There you go. I thought he was from the Rembrandts. I was like, did that guy write the Friends? Anyway.
No, but oddly enough, before you go on to that day, that they think, or Cameron Crowe is convinced that they stole singles as the idea for Friends.
It makes sense.
So
there was so much of a rush on that one. that it kind of makes
all I
sense.
have to all I have to say is I think that like it's interesting that everyone is like focused on Seattle and this sound came from Seattle, but I kind of think otherwise. And maybe I've had too many beers tonight and I'm just sort of like conspiracy theorist, but you know, I think there were other bands that were definitely huge in this scene, and like Smashing Pumpkins definitely is one of them. And this movie was supposed to be this sort of commercial success, and this is like how they were going to like. Every band had sort of put out their albums, you know, a year or a couple months before this, and everything just sort of came out conveniently at the same time to make this sort of like, you know, this is the singles grunge soundtrack. Anyway, I mean, I loved Alice in Chains, and Wood was, and it still is an amazing song. I think that sort of transcends out of this scene.
Well, that whole album was great too. So
yeah, and this came out before Dirt, or at least they had written it before Dirt. And yeah, I had no idea that it was written for Andy Wood. And like, I'm not the biggest Mother Love Bone. So Andy Wood played for a band called Mother Love Bone. And he had overdosed, you know, just recent, you know, I think recently before this movie was written. So I think around 1990 or 91, he had overdosed.
It would have been before that, and probably 89, 90.
Yeah. And then you have the remaining members minus Eddie Vedder, who formed Pearl Jam. And so it was like these guys just, you know, when you take a look at the track listings, it's all either Soundgarden, Chris Cornell, or Pearl Jam. And so it's basically a bunch of friends who are like, this is our scene. And then in the background, you have kind of Smashing Pumpkins and Mark Lanigan as well. And he was from a band called Screaming Trees, right? So that guy was from Seattle?
I'm
pretty sure Screaming Trees were from there.
Yeah, because Screaming Trees were on here for sure, yep.
I was never a huge Screaming Trees fan, but I saw him much later in like 2011, and he was amazing. And, you know, he went on to do a whole bunch of stuff. Like there was a lot of stuff that he did. I think he was actually like a member of Queens of the Stone Age for a little while. But
yeah, he's got a bit of a revolving door on some of those guys.
Absolutely.
He brings in.
But I think, sorry, Mike, I feel like I'm completely like rambling on here. I don't have any sort of like, and I think that's the whole thing. Like you start with Wood and it just sort of trickles down into this like huge sort of like tree of different artists, and they're all playing, like I'd mentioned before, there's Temple of the Dog.
Well, they were all so close on the scene. You look at Chris Cornell was roommates with Wood. And
Mad Season, in which featured Mark Lanigan, and I didn't realize that also Mike McCready and Lane Staley, of course, and who else was in Mad Season?
Yeah, it was a great album,
right?
Yeah, I love Mad Season. I forget who else is in there.
Yeah.
Those are the two that I remember, though, Mike McCready and Lane Staley.
So it sort of just trickles down from,
that I love,
you know, Alice in Chains, which I wouldn't even say is like the definitive band of this movie.
Not at all. They were more metal than the others, for sure.
I don't know, man. Maybe. Do you think so?
I think so. They had a little different vein to them.
They're kind of, I mean, Soundgarden, if I had to pick a metal band out of all those grunge bands, I would pick Soundgarden, I think. Just that earlier stuff, I don't know, even the later stuff has got some in it. I don't know.
Right.
But Alice in Chains was...
Cantrell had like for sure, a heavy hand, but I think Lane Staley just had this voice that was...
Yeah, definitely.
You couldn't really classify it. You couldn't really fit it into like a metal genre, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Yeah.
Oh, vocally, man, when you think about that
It's
era,
insane. Chris
and that
Cornell, like
grunge,
what a
No, not
fucking
vocally.
range.
it's
right?
vocally,
Like,
it's unbelievable. You
Eddie
think of
Vedder.
Lane Staley, Chris Cornell. Yeah, even Eddie Vedder.
Oh, huge.
Like
Yep.
all those guys vocally were unbelievable. Like it's. But I think that I guess the question
And I was thinking
is,
about that.
without Pearl Jam, Nevermind, does any of this shit happen?
Pearl Jam, Nevermind. Rewind.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I was thinking
Nirvana,
about that.
Nevermind. If without that,
Thank
does
you.
that
None of
happen?
this would happen. None of this would happen because it was microseconds before, and if that album didn't blow up the way that it did, we would not have heard of these other bands, because as soon as that went huge, all these record labels were cramming to find anyone that sounded anything like, or that were in the same general region, or that kind of a deal. Who can we get that's could be possibly marketable that would be somewhat similar to? So,
And I want to see Pearl Jam cover and Nevermind on that. Going back to that, I want to see that cover.
And like going back to like the singers, I think I loved I love Nirvana, but you go back to it and you listen to him and he kind of sounds like Popeye. You like listen to some of the live stuff, and he doesn't have a range at all. I mean, he was a fucking junkie on a guitar that like had some great ideas, but when you think about some of these, I mean, you have Chris Cornell of Soundgarden, you have Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam, you have Stone Temple Pilots with Scott. These girls just are fucking making me forgetful here. Scott Weiland, right? Like these were singers. These, I mean, and I say were unfortunately because the only ones alive is Eddie Vedder. But these were all singers, and like Kurt Cobain was kind of a singer, but he was more of a screamer than a singer.
Well, I had found out too. I told Mike that I found out on one of those facts that Kurt Cobain recorded all in Euro
I bet
vocals in one night, laid it all out in one night. So I'm like, I don't think that Chris Cornell laid down Bad Motorfinger in one night. Like I don't think that he. Like I don't think he just went in there and was able to rip that off, because it's a totally different thing. Right?
And to a larger point, I think this whole sort of grunge thing is really a strange way of compartmentalizing like a bunch of very different bands into one genre. And when you really listen to them, it's hard to put. And even as like a kid, I was diehard Nirvana all the way. I loved them. I loved them to death. And I wasn't such a Pearl Jam fan, but a lot of people lumped them into
they were not the same thing. And it's funny too.
They were not the same thing.
I got digging into a bunch of stuff a few years ago, and I always laugh. Well, a few years ago, probably 10 plus, there was a thing with, it was a documentary on grunge, and they were talking about the start of the name or the label of grunge, and apparently it came from Sub Pop, where as soon as Nirvana hit, there was all these big media industry people phoning Sub Pop and asking them questions. What is grunge? What is this and that? And it was grunge was the term grunge was just a made up thing that Sub Pop did. Like they had this whole list of special vocabulary that they invented as a joke, just to tell to these other companies that were trying to mass produce and make as much money as they could off of this apparent scene kind of a deal. So
yeah, and it's funny, and you saw when I was doing my research, I was looking at who was it? Jean-Paul Gaultier, some sort of like fashion
Yes.
guy. And all of a sudden they're walking down the runway looking like lumberjacks.
Flannel socks.
It was, yeah, it was. And for me, I remember like this music, there was all of this, you know, I'm at the age where I'm just sort of being very influenced by a lot of
Well, we were
things
at
in,
the
like,
tail end of
me.
that, really, for the most part. When we discovered them, it was at the tail end of that for the most part.
Yeah, yeah. But for me, it was authentic.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what I'm getting at, right? It was something that was authentic, and then it was quickly taken over by commercialism. And I'm not someone who's going to like gripe about the, you know, the clause of commercialism and how bad it is. But I think it's really interesting how something so authentic and how gritty and grimy and someone made up a word called grunge, and yet it fit. And it was so quickly taken over by, let's just say, a mass appeal to make $1 off of it. And I think that sort of sums up the movie Singles. You know, it wasn't at all, you know, we were earlier in a couple podcasts before, we were talking about how soundtracks, how they either worked with movies or didn't work with movies, or they were made specifically for a movie. And I think in this case, this was a movie riding off the coattails of a really amazing soundtrack with a bunch of bands who had found their voice, and then it was quickly taken away, you know, by a bunch of people who wanted to make money off of it. And I guess that's like,
the cool thing about this is it was released prior to the explosion, or it was filmed, and all these bands, it's like a time capsule. So you look at Soundgarden, and you look at Pearl Jam, and you look at Alice in Chains.
That scene with Alice in Chains is fucking crazy.
And this is all before they got big. So it's like a nice little time capsule of how Seattle was, like how the bands
they had already released. Yeah, you're right. To some
it was
extent,
before they blew up.
Already had,
they weren't a household name, right? So they were still had their little
on
pocket.
Like a huge, massive scale, for sure. Yeah, but I think they had already found like their fan base before this.
They were getting traction, but it was still a local Seattle thing when this was recorded, or when this was this album was recorded, and the movie was filmed prior to the explosion of grunge, is basically what I'm saying. Like, it was just before everything blew up and it was mainstream and everybody had to have a piece of the pie. And it's kind of cool to be able to see these bands in this movie in a small club, every one of them in a small club, playing the songs before they blew up.
So I'm just going to throw this out there. A lot of people think the death of grunge was when Kurt Cobain killed himself, but
I agree.
Maybe it was Singles. Maybe Singles in 1992, bringing grunge to the masses and making
That's why he offed himself.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea, Dane. That's maybe
that's
exactly
why Courtney
what happened.
killed him.
And then it just pissed Kurt Cobain off to the point where
that's why Courtney killed him. Yep.
Courtney loved. Oh, we'll edit that out. Sorry,
man.
Back that up.
Yeah,
when Courtney killed him, you mean?
No,
but honestly, conspiracy theories.
I went to see this movie because of the soundtrack, and the movie had nothing to do with the soundtrack.
Yep.
And again, I think it was also amazing because the soundtrack had a whole bunch of singles, brand new music from a bunch of bands that I loved. And that's what sucked me in. It had nothing to do with what's his face, or who's it's Matt. What's his face wearing a wig?
Matt Dillon.
Matt Dillon wearing a wig. And
Matt Dillon. Yeah,
cool. I'd like the reason why I went to go see this movie was because of the soundtrack, and like I had already made up my mind.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it did open up, you know, I think a lot of doors for a lot of people who may have been wanting something else as far as like the music that they were listening to. So, and when you really dig into it, again, like when you take a look at Stone Gossard and Matt McCready and their ties to Pearl Jam and Mother Love Bone and Mad Season and Temple of the Dog and then all the people that sort of like came out of that. There's a giant web of like really good music. And shit, if you collect vinyl, then take a look at this and just take a look at the degrees of separation, and you could find some really good music in here.
Well, I really love this. I really love this album too because, I mean, it spawned probably my favorite Pearl Jam song ever, "State of Love and Trust," which was meant to be on the. It was recorded during the 10 sessions, and it was kind of meant to be on it. It just never made the cut for whatever reason. But I still think to this day that it's probably their strongest. Well, for me, it's their strongest offering.
Yeah, I love that song too. It's good. And it kind of, when you listen to that, it sounds like a little bit in between 10 and Verses. It almost doesn't fit on 10, and it kind of fits on Verses, but almost doesn't. So it's a good as a B-side. But again, too, right? Like that, probably at the time when you're coming out with those songs, like when you're brand new like that and trying to make it big, coming out with another track that is not going to be on your album, or having a track and be like, here you go. Like, it just feels like we've got a lot of these. We can come up with more of these, kind of like Prince we were talking about. But, feels like a song like that can be on an album, and it can be big. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't, right? And I kind of think it's cool when it doesn't. You can only get that song on this album.
Billy Corben didn't think so.
But you know what? You got a good point though too, right? Like, I thought all those bands on there were Seattle, and then you're like, oh, they're from Chicago, and I'm like, yeah, I guess Smashing Pumpkins are on there too. I don't know how they got on there.
Still don't understand why they were on there. It doesn't make any sense.
Because they were fucking good. They had a sound that was different.
Did, but when this came out, it was so early on that nobody knew that they had that sound. So,
for sure people did. They had Kish way before this, didn't they?
Not way.
But before.
They were playing Lollapalooza then, though, too, weren't they? Like, Smashing Pumpkins was on the bill.
So Perry Farrell, I mean, like, if we're talking about the master behind who made grunge happen. Like, we were just talking on a previous podcast about, like, why did Pearl Jam play with Cypress Hill? I mean, it was like this vision of all of these bands playing at Lollapalooza, and that was Perry Farrell from Jane's Addiction, right?
Yeah.
And they were around, oh my God, in the 80s. Yeah. And they were amazing. Dave Navarro, they had that surf rock, but like obviously drug infused and like very aggressive, but not in a dark way type of sound. And like,
but all those bands together, when you actually put the landscape of this together, like none of those bands, like we just said, sound alike. When you put those on the stage,
they all had
and
their
you
own
say,
thing.
Jane's Addiction, Smashing Pumpkins, Soundgarden. Well, that's all the same genre, but do those bands sound anything like each other? No. You would never put those together. They don't sound anything alike, right?
Thought.
But it all just got pigeonholed.
Pearl Jam, they weren't grunge. Their first album was lumped in, but nothing sounded like it.
No. And then you put Nirvana in that mix, and that completely messes the whole thing up. And you're like, none of that sounds like that.
Yep.
So it was kind of funny how that just, like, it was a wide brush. Mm-hmm. Grunge was a wide brush, and we were all just kind of along for the ride. We were like, who else is in this group? Like, who else hangs out? Like, oh, STP's in here? Cool. Like, like, it felt like it was just like another one added to the pile every time. And you were like, oh, these guys are in here too. Never heard of these guys. But again, I think singles catapulted that.
It was a good launching point. Yep.
For me, it was. Yeah, I just remember hearing it for the first time and then sparking everything off of that.
Sure.
Right? So,
yeah. It's even funny. I mean, like, I've been a Melvins fan for a long time, and I wouldn't even classify the Melvins as grunge, but like, you take a look at some of this stuff, and they're quoted as being like the godfathers of grunge, and
Well,
maybe
without Melvins, without Melvins, there probably wouldn't be Nirvana, and that's a big influence too, because they were just that much.
Pixies too.
Them, right?
Pixies are in there as well. Yeah, like all.
Sonic Youth. I mean, like I didn't even really like Mudhoney.
One thing leads to another.
I mean, they were there too. So like there was, and that's maybe if we can look at like a good scene is something which is not homogenized. It's something that has like variety to it, and we can have a discussion about it. And I think maybe that's what made grunge into a movement where sure it sparked, or it was apparently from Seattle. It had that Seattle or Washington, Oregon kind of roots, but I think it was much more than that. When you take a look into it and you peel back the layers, it's really interesting to see how it was really like a nationwide thing that kind of happened at the same time without the internet. And when you really sort of like try and pigeonhole it, it's difficult. You can't say this band is grunge or that band is grunge, but it wasn't hair metal, and it wasn't, post-punk rock, whatever was happening in the early to late 90s either, or sorry, early to late 80s. It's just something that's really hard to define. And I think, anyway, that's why I picked this album, because I think it was like an interesting snapshot. And looking back at it, 92, that, may have been the apex of it, I think. So a launching point, but also like somewhat.
This album was definitely a launching point. Yeah, definitely.
You can see a bunch of people just having a fun ride.
Springboard.
Yeah. I mean, why do they all like heroin anyway?
The beginning of the end.
Yeah, gross.
How could you not like heroin? Come on now.
Must be really available in Seattle and surrounding area.
Yeah.
Just as Jimi Hendrix, he was on the album too.
He was there.
Right? Yeah. Oh, what a nice track, and what a nice sort of like departure from everything
I read
else,
too.
Right?
Yeah. Cameron Crowe had a difficult time getting the rights for that track to go on there. Yeah, and they said he said it's even harder now to get music out of there. The Hendrix vault. Yes, keeps coming out with new albums. I don't know. The guy's been dead since 1970.
And there's that, but what about the whole Ann and Nancy Wilson, the whole heart thing? The Lovemongers. I mean, that one came out of nowhere.
The Lovemongers
on this list.
Heart.
Yes. It just seems like it fits because, but it kind of stood out a little bit, having that Zeppelin cover in the mix.
Yeah, it did. Well, even those Paul Westerberg tracks are not like the other ones, but there's something about them that I just
no.
Dig.
You can't get away with that
they were.
these days.
Yeah.
Like those ones. Yeah. Yeah, it's classic. But
what did you think of it, Mike? Was it a decent cover?
It was extremely well done.
Zeppelin.
But anybody that covers Zeppelin is a hard sell for me. So,
right,
it was very well done, but I'd prefer to listen to Zeppelin doing it. So,
which makes me want to like go back to a previous podcast where we were talking about Purple Rain, and Fish did a cover of the song Purple Rain. Has anyone seen
I have not. No, I haven't followed
rather?
Fish. No.
Oh man, I hate Fish, and this will make you hate Fish even more. It's horrible. Anyway.
Cool.
And you know what? I'll just end it on this. What's his name? The bass player from Pearl Jam.
Jeff Ament.
Yeah, Jeff Ament. This was the first time I ever saw someone play a fretless.
So cool.
Like electric bass. And an 8th string. Right?
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, that threw my little mind for a spin. I was like, what the fuck?
All right, that's it for episode 5. Thanks for hanging out with us. Please subscribe and comment on our YouTubes. Like and share on Instagram at B-Sides and Beers Podcast. Follow on Spotify. Subscribe, rate, and share on Apple Podcasts. Pretty much every other streaming platform. Thanks a lot. Cheers.